This is Nintendo's Game Boy Link cable. Without this, Pokemon would have never sold hundreds of millions of video games, printed tens of billions of trading cards, and had hundreds of millions of people play Pokemon Go. Pikachu is a ubiquitous part of pop culture, conquering everything from anime to high art.
But what Pikachu and his pals do just as well is sell. They will earn over $1 billion this year.
But how exactly did Nintendo's failing peripheral lead to the creation of one of gaming's most iconic brands, helping it stand the test of time over 30 years later? This is a story about how a failing Nintendo accessory spawned Pokemon's $100 billion empire. It's April 1989. The hottest device on the market is Nintendo's Game Boy, instantly selling hundreds of thousands of units thanks to its revolutionary ability to play games anywhere. But despite the portability, the Game Boy experience wasn't designed solely to be a lonely one. Although not as celebrated, a peripheral designed to link multiple systems together also arrived at launch.
And for head-to-head competition, use Video Link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power.
While most gamers were using their Game Boys to play hit games like Tetris and Dr. Mario, players weren't interested in those games for their multiplayer capabilities, even if they had them. The Game Link cable was anything but a must-buy accessory. After 8 years and more than 130 games, Nintendo failed to generate a truly killer app for the Game Link. While Bomberman and Street Fighter II pushed the limits of the Game Link cable's real-time capabilities, most multiplayer games on the Game Boy were still designed and sold as single-player experiences with an additional scaled-down multiplayer component. But Game Freak co-founder Satoshi Tajiri saw the potential, and he had an idea that would change the cable's fortunes. He just needed a little help. Satoshi Tajiri was a kid obsessed with bugs. Growing up in suburban Tokyo, he became so obsessed with wandering in forests and collecting insects that he was once referred to as Dr. Bug. Eventually, the forests he once foraged for insects were urbanized and developed into buildings and roads, but that childlike wonder and obsession for collecting the smallest of creatures never really faded. Fast forward to 1990. Tajiri, now the co-founder of game developer Game Freak, found himself pitching Nintendo on a game where the player would capture and collect monsters in pocket-sized capsules to trade them with friends. How would you trade with friends exactly? Tajiri pitched the use of what he considered to be Game Boy's underappreciated accessory, the Game Link cable. The idea stemmed from Tajiri's experience with Dragon Quest II, trying and ultimately failing to earn a rare item that he wished he could trade with a friend instead of trying to earn it. He also imagined bugs crawling between one Game Boy to another via the Game Link cable while watching two people play on a train. These ideas eventually became the core building blocks of the original pitch for Capsule Monsters.
Forget the monster.
The game was met with skepticism due to the ambitious nature of the project. Nintendo struggled to see the appeal since nothing like this had ever been done before. Thankfully, Shigeru Miyamoto, another game designer who famously pitched a game based on his childhood adventures, took a liking to Tajiri's idea and helped convince Nintendo to give what was dubbed Capsule Monsters the green light, as well as offering his services as a producer. Capsule Monsters up to this point struggled to get off the ground, but with the backing of an industry legend, a new genre was about to be birthed, but one that would never have existed without the Game Link. Miyamoto suggested to realize the potential of the trading strategy and encourage its use, players needed more. In a moment of brilliance, he suggested introducing multiple carts with slight variations on available monsters so players would be encouraged to trade with each other in order to catch them all.
You can grab a link cable and a friend with a Game Boy, and with both packs you can catch them all.
Quote, "At first, there were no plans for the different red-blue carts. It was just going to be a single cart, but I wanted to do something a little more creative for this. Since the core of the game was catching and trading Pokemon, creating two different cart versions, which had slightly different chances for each Pokemon to appear, would encourage and necessitate friends to trade with each other and make the whole experience more fun." He realized that trading was an integral part of the Pokemon experience and stated, quote, "It struck me as a novel use of the Game Boy hardware, a new gameplay experience that couldn't be had on any other system." Tajari had also hoped that the game would be a way for players to develop friendships through its heavy use of the Game Link cable, since Capsule Monster's endgame required trading and battling other people in the real world. Unlike the majority of Game Boy games, Pokemon took a staggering 5 years to develop. It was an ambitious game that pushed the limits of the system. Because of this ambition, it's reported that employees claimed that they went unpaid at times, and Tajari stopped taking a salary in order to help with studio costs. To help keep the lights on and maintain their grand vision for Pokemon, Game Freak also took on other projects, such as developing Yoshi on the NES and Mario & Wario on the Super Nintendo. The Game Boy cartridge's 1 MB storage capacity also posed a significant roadblock for Game Freak's original vision. Early design documents suggested that there were well over 150 original monsters pitched for the game, and while some of those were redesigned and merged into the core 150 Pocket monsters in red and green, this number of monsters was simply too much for Game Boy's 1 MB cartridge. To get the game down to size, Game Freak cut content such as additional monsters, map size, and battle system modifiers such as Dark and Steel-type Pokemon. Memory limitations and finances weren't the only motivators behind Pocket Monster's struggles. Constant gameplay and presentation changes also reared their ugly heads. The original design for the game had a heavier emphasis on trading, selling, and aggressively training Pokemon. According to the original pitch documents, players would capture Pokemon with the use of a Charisma stat and be more active in Pokemon battles by using a whip. For obvious reasons, mostly due to Pokemon being a kid's game, the whip was taken away from the good guys, but did stay in the hands of nefarious characters like Team Rocket. Despite all of these hurdles, and after nearly 6 years of development and a studio nearly shutting down, Red and Green would release in the spring of 1996, giving not only a much-needed boost to the aging Nintendo console, but finally breathe life into its neglected Game Link cable. The Game Link cable was not only responsible for the creation of Pokemon, but was also an integral part of the game's DNA. Ever since its humble beginning, every mainline Pokemon game has the player catching Pokemon so that they can train them up for battle. Some Pokemon can only evolve through trading, while others only exist on one version of each game, such as Growlithe on Pokemon Blue and Meowth on Red. From the start, if you wanted to complete your Pokédex, you needed the Game Link cable. Despite its intrinsic value to Pokemon though, the Game Link cable wasn't a very sophisticated piece of tech. In its first iteration, the cable was roughly capable of moving a whopping 1 kilobyte of data per second, which is roughly the size of a 150 to 200 word email, which is ironically about the length of the script I'm using to describe the Game Link's transfer speed. A 1 megabyte file, also known as 1000 kilobytes, like this JPEG of Haunter, would take about 17 minutes to download over the Game Link cable. The limited tech powering the Game Boy meant that Game Freak had to be very clever with how trading and battling could work. Battles and trading on the first generation of Pokemon games were never real-time, but also never felt as slow as 1 kilobyte per second would suggest. Two Game Boys' peer-to-peer connection allowed players to send each other small packets of information that were only a few bits in size. If Player Red attacked Player Blue, the games wouldn't display that in real time, but rather Red's cartridge would send a small amount of data to Blue. Blue would then accept and confirm the package was secured, they would shake hands, and then both games would simultaneously play their battle animations, calculate damages, and other status effects. This would repeat until the battle was won. Trading, on the other hand, was far more difficult. While the actual trade itself would take a split second, the verification process and handshake between the two Game Boys would require redundancy checks and confirmations to avoid data corruption, which is why, as a kid, I may or may not have abused the system in order to clone an entire team of Blastoise by yanking the cable from my Game Boy in the middle of a transfer. This slow verification process is why the game featured a longer than usual animation showing the traded Pokemon traveling through the cable itself, something Satoshi Tajiri had imagined while watching two people play Tetris on a train. You could argue, though, that its success wasn't just down to technical innovation, but rather its marriage with its branding. Gotta catch 'em all was a brilliant slogan. Not only did it encourage two copies of the same game to be purchased for completionists, but it also made the Game Link cable an essential companion. The Game Link finally had its killer app 8 years after it was launched. Sure, you can play Pokemon without a link cable, but if you wanted to battle and trade with friends, the game link cable was crucial. Despite its innovation though, the technology at the time meant trading was slow and combat had to be turn-based to accommodate the cable's limitations. This still persists in the mainline games today, despite their progress. Battles on a massive scale and mass trading could be achieved with ease in 2026, but would it still feel like Pokemon? Those limitations from the original Game Boy hardware have hard-coded Pokemon into something familiar, and changing that would alter the core experience that fans still cherish today. While spin-offs have introduced more robust combat and less tedious ways to trade monsters, the fundamentals dictated by the Game Link cable's limitations remain deeply rooted in the game's DNA today. After 3 decades, the series has sold over 489 million games. Pokemon cards have become their own microeconomy, with many listed for millions of dollars. And the series has entered the mainstream with major Hollywood movies, a long-running anime, dozens of spin-off shows, and amusement parks. Look, you name it, there's a Pokemon on it. While it's hard to think of a world without Charizard, Pikachu, or the 1,000 other creatures, it's even stranger to think that if it wasn't for Nintendo's desire to popularize the cable and one man's vision to translate his childhood memories of bug catching into a game, Pokemon may have never existed.